Chapter 8. It took every ounce of self-control Tidus had not to fidget, not to cross and uncross his arms, not to shift his weight from foot to foot. Muse stood next to him, completely unconcerned with making small talk, just standing serene, unbothered, relaxed. Tidus had none of those feelings. He had never been in a situation where he didn't know about the rules and expectations. His parents had made sure of that. And now he had no idea what was expected of him. Rules, etiquette, standards like that had always seemed so annoying when his mother was constantly reminding him of them. But now that he didn't have those to fall back on, he felt lost, small. The silence left too much room for his mind to wander. Spasms of pain shot through him every time he lost focus, the memory of death always just inches away. He wished he had even one more hour with his family, just a little more time to get Kiun to be able to look at him, to comfort Ilaria after all he had put her through, to figure out a proper goodbye. When would he even get to see them again? Their absence already left a sick feeling in his stomach. The shuttle broke through the atmosphere, and Tidus stared with wide eyes at the epoch's echo. It was the largest ship Tidus had ever seen in person, visible from the ground like an orbiting moon. Getting closer to it made Tidus feel like he was shrinking. The triple-headed golden dragon crest of the Empire was emblazoned at its center. The crest of the Omni Tempore, a dragon-gilded hourglass encircled by an Ouroboros, was cradled in its wings. The back of the ship had sweeping fins, and a twisting cage of metal that held the central device for a void engine. The shuttle docked smoothly, landing like an insect on the skin of the epoch's echo and sealing its airlock against the larger ship. Muse walked onto the main ship without a word or a glance in his direction. After a heartbeat of hesitation, Tidus followed her. He attempted to mimic her purposeful stride, to at least look less lost than he felt. "Tell me, Tidus," Muse said as Tidus caught up to her and fell into step behind her. "What do you think of your place here?" He was relieved she spoke with her audible voice again, instead of directly into his mind. Of all the questions she could have asked, Tidus had no idea how to answer that one. Was he supposed to know something about the training system or the hierarchy? Should he sound confident, or would that make him seem ignorantly entitled? He was terrified, mostly, but a large part of him was still giddy at the thought of joining an angelic legion, of being just one circle away from the God Emperor himself. But that felt like a childish, undignified answer. Better to play it safe for now, until he figured out the rules of this place. "It is an honor," Tidus said, "to have this opportunity to serve the Empire." Muse laughed so hard she snorted, hands on her belly as she doubled over. Tidus felt heat rush up his neck and cheeks, and he fought not to outwardly cringe. So much for playing it safe. "I guess I should have expected that kind of answer from someone like you," she remarked, gesturing towards him with one hand. "Someone like me?" Tidus asked, confused. What kind of an answer would she expect from someone else? And what was it about him that made him so, predictable? "You're a Dothr and rich boy," Muse said. "Your answer was just very, well, you know, very devout and pious of you." Tidus blinked, trying to wrap his mind around what she was saying. "I see," he said. It was a lie, and the side-eye she gave him told him they both knew it. "It's not a bad thing," Muse reasoned with a sigh. "That attitude will serve you well here, actually. I just don't hear that kind of thing from recruits a lot." "What do you usually hear?" Tidus asked, trying to test the waters. Rather than a chess game, talking to Muse was like trying to walk blindfolded through a maze. At least she had dropped most of her formality now, but her presence still made his instincts scream danger. "Nothing so composed," Muse stated. "Questions, panic. Sometimes they just cry." Tidus nodded. His first time reset had been horrific, and he had been completely unprepared. Even the second time, it had felt like everything was spinning out of control. Did all Timecasters discover their powers by dying? That would be enough to drive anyone into hysterics. "Yeah, that makes sense," Tidus acknowledged finally. "I thought you might surprise me, though," Muse said. "I mean, I've never picked up a recruit who had the guts to do what you did." Tidus froze mid-step, then quickly tried to cover it up with a fake cough, and hurried to catch back up to her. Nerves exploded in his chest like a swarm of bees. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Don't play dumb," Muse replied sharply. "I know you initiated 2 resets before I got to you." A sliver of ice worked its way down Tidus' spine, and he shoved his hands into his pockets. His mind raced. She already knew what he had done. They knew he had killed himself more than once. It wouldn't be hard for them to guess why. Did they know about Ilaria? He hoped not. Even if he was a lost cause, he had to protect her. "That kind of metal means you've more than likely got what it takes," Muse continued, either not noticing or not caring about his poorly concealed distress. Is that all? I mean, Tidus stammered. He shouldn't have said anything, but the fear of repercussions gripped his bones and wouldn't let go. He needed to know if he had already lost. "What? You think I should punish you?" Muse turned to fix him with a piercing stare. I did choose to do what I did, but Tidus took a deep breath. How could he explain his fear without just incriminating himself further? "You worry that because it is better to die once, you have doomed your soul?" Tidus swallowed hard and nodded. "Tell me, which of the great flaws do you think you fell prey to?" What?" Tidus frowned. "Cowardice?" Muse pressed. Tidus shook his head. "No, I don't think it could be." "Clemency," she continued. "Conceit." The word pricked him like a sliver under his fingernail, and Tidus grimaced. "Well, it would be conceit, wouldn't it? If it is." "No," Muse said with a dry laugh. "Those guilty of conceit do not so readily admit to it." Tidus clenched his fists, his palms slick with perspiration. A bead of sweat trickled down his neck. "The point, Antirrhinum," Muse declared, "is that the rules apply a little differently to us. Dying only once is a luxury, one we offer to the citizens of the Empire. As Caliban Voidforged wrote in his treatise, it is only through the depths of sacrifice that we can reach the ultimate heights of glory. Those of us blessed with such glory are thus capable of such sacrifice. So long as you don't fall prey to the flaws, you will be fine." Tidus nodded. "Right," he said. That makes sense. Thank you." Muse turned and kept walking without responding. Tidus bit his lip and followed. He had barely been able to pay attention to where they had been walking, just trying to keep up with Muse. They rounded a corner, crossed a threshold, and Tidus blinked, taking in the room around him, an ornately decorated ceremonial chamber. Tidus realized he was gaping, but couldn't quite keep his eyes from betraying his awe. He had been on other ships. a planet hopper that took them to Olethros, the space archipelago in the Nora system, even a few larger ships with their own void engines for off-world vacations. Those ships had been impressive, but compared to this, their design seemed ramshackle, empty and plain, easily trussed up to fit whatever was called for. All of them had an underlying feeling of liminal space to them, of impermanence. This room was like something Tidus would expect to find in one of the temples or cathedrals on Dothara. It felt old, like it had always existed, and it carried authority. The walls were lined with spiral pillars, the designs breaking off into veined branches that latticed over the ceiling. Between the branches, painted stars shone through. Tidus caught sight of the major constellations: the blade of the silent whisper, the mother's lyre, the watcher's shield, the anvil and spark, and at the center of the ceiling, the purple eye of Ling, the unchartable nebula that was visible no matter where in the Empire you went. Wow, Tidus marveled, then snapped his jaw shut when he remembered he wasn't here alone, and he should probably have been paying attention to Muse instead of staring at painted stars. He tore his gaze away from the ceiling. Sorry. Muse stood at the platform in the middle of the room and gestured for him to join her. Tidus walked over and stood facing her. You wondered what I meant about surviving your destiny? Muse said, taking a more serious, formal tone, but not the same as when she had met his family. The way she spoke and stood now made the very air around them feel heavier. Today, you begin your training to become a member of the Omni Tempore. We are one of the 8 angelic legions, the pillars of the Empire. We uphold and protect the Empire and the Emperor and spread his light through all of existence. Tidus realized he was holding his breath and let it out slowly so he didn't sway on his feet. The only word for this was surreal. Of the angelic legions, there were 3 you could never work your way into, no matter how dedicated you were, because members of those 3 had to be chosen, gifted: the Veritas Ruptore, the Shadow Keepers, and, of course, the Omni Tempore. Tidus had spent so much time and energy trying to find a way to be good enough for his father. It had been exhausting. He had thought that when he figured it out, found his angle, what he had an edge in, it would make things easier. So far, it had only made every moment of his existence worse. As you have already discovered, Timecasters are difficult to permanently kill, Muse said. Impossible, in fact, under most circumstances. You will simply get to come back and try again until you are victorious, or until you lose your mind. There is, however, an exception. The hair along the back of Tidus' neck prickled, like a cold wind had blown down his spine. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, never mind having no idea what he was even supposed to say to any of this. Muse held her hands out over the platform between them. He had thought originally that it was marble, but now that he looked down, he saw it was stained glass. A golden glow ignited in the center of it, then rose until the glass surface opened up, like it was melting away. An ornate golden dagger floated into Muse's waiting hands. Equipped with the right tools, Muse explained, turning the dagger to lay flat in her palms, Timecasters can kill each other. We keep one another in check, push each other to become great, ensure that only the strongest, the most worthy, serve the Emperor. Tidus swallowed, his eyes glued to the glittering blade held in front of him. The only thing that could permanently kill him. That knowledge made it seem more dangerous, sinister, almost like it had a mind of its own. Muse cleared her throat. This one, is yours," she said, holding it closer to his face. Tidus stepped back in surprise. "What? Right now? But I don't even know what I'm doing yet." Tidus spluttered, sweat slicking his palms just at the thought of touching the weapon. "You'll learn," Muse said, "and it doesn't take a genius to figure out not to stab yourself. You're receiving this blade as your entry into Omni Tempore training. It's symbolic. You should understand that." Tidus was taken aback. The way she said, "You should understand that," was the same intonation she'd used when she had said she should have expected his answer about why he was here. The words felt like underhanded insults, but he couldn't figure out what the insult was. Either way, he didn't want to argue, and rejecting the symbolic acceptance to train for an angelic legion was definitely a bad idea. Tidus reached out and gingerly took the dagger. The only other time he had ever come close to wielding a bladed weapon was the disassembled pruning shears he had used to kill himself. It felt wrong in his hand at first, but then he wrapped his fingers around the hilt, and it seemed to fit like it had been molded for him specifically. So right, even when moments ago it had seemed so wrong. It was smooth and warm and gave off some sort of energy that lit up his nerves, but not in a painful way. Where am I supposed to keep it?" Tidus asked slowly, turning the blade so it caught his reflection. His own red eyes gazed back at him, full of apprehension and fear. Lost. "In its sheath," Muse said with a hint of amusement in her voice. Tidus got the distinct impression he was being pranked somehow, and narrowed his eyes. He hated not knowing what was going on. It was like he just didn't speak the same language as Muse. He focused on the blade. It hadn't come with a sheath, and he didn't want to ask another question that would make him sound stupid. How would he expect to carry this thing around? Tidus tried to remember ever seeing someone with this kind of weapon, but the only ones he'd seen were ceremonial. This was probably mostly ceremonial, too. This couldn't be the main weapon of the Omni Tempore. Priests would carry something like this as part of a ritual, but what about when it wasn't in hand? The only thing he could think of was a sheath being worn at the hip. As he thought it and pictured it, Tidus felt something around him shift. He glanced down and yelped. An ornate ivory sheath was now clipped to the waistband of his pants. In his surprise, he almost dropped the knife, and then almost sliced his hand open in an attempt not to drop it. "Watch it," Muse hissed, though laughter sparkled in her wide-set eyes. "Wouldn't want to end your career so soon." "Right," Tidus said, swallowing against a sudden dryness in his throat. He carefully slid the knife into the sheath. The fit was perfectly smooth. "Congratulations," Muse said, "and welcome to training. Don't get the wrong idea. Having that knife doesn't make you Omni Tempore. You have to actually earn your place for that. For the time being, the Epoch's Echo will be your home, your introductory classroom, if you will. Tomorrow, you'll start classes to learn the basics, and make sure you don't fracture reality, or turn yourself inside out on accident. There are a few other new recruits who will join you. Any questions?" Tidus opened his mouth because, yes, he had about 100 questions, but Muse immediately held up a hand to stop him. "Any questions you need to ask me, specifically right now, that you can't figure out on your own or wait a class for?" she clarified. Tidus hesitated, running over his list of questions. Most of them could probably wait for class, he guessed. Several of his questions were, upon closer examination, more of an incoherent feeling of panic. That could wait, for sure. He needed to know where he was going, where his room would be, but the ship AI assistant would be able to help him with that. That only left one question for Muse. "Just one question, ma'am," he said finally. "What's the Epoch's Echo's assistant's name?" A smile flickered at the corners of Muse's mouth. "Smart kid," she said. "It's Timothy." With that, she turned on her heel and left Tidus alone in the ceremonial chamber. Tidus let out a slow breath, his hand brushing absently against the dagger at his hip. It made him feel strange and off balance, and yet a part of him. He wished Muse had given him more of an explanation than the 3 bullet points she had thrown at him. But clearly there would be no hand-holding in Omni Tempore training. If he was going to survive meeting his destiny, he would have to do it on his own. Chapter 9. Tidus left the ceremonial chamber, following directions from the Timothy AI in search of his room. So far, the entire ship had turned out to be just as impressive as that first room, if not quite as ceremonial-looking. Only the occasional interface panel on the wall or a view screen to the stars gave away at all that Tidus was on a ship, and not just inside a building on the planet's surface. Tidus had spotted a few cleaning bots and other robotic staff, but aside from Muse, he hadn't seen another actual person this entire time. So he nearly jumped out of his shoes when a girl with violet skin, curling horns, and jade-green eyes appeared in front of him as he rounded a corner. Hello, miss," Tidus said, quickly straightening. The girl was taller than him, but not by much. He realized the horns made her seem taller than she was. She probably wasn't much older than him, if she was older at all. She snorted at his surprise and flicked her barbed tail. "Hey," she said. "I thought I smelled a new kid." "Oh," Tidus said. He really should have been better prepared for meeting the other recruits. Muse had told him they were here, after all. The violet girl was leaning casually to the side, her tail jumping around like a bored hummingbird. But she managed to block him from simply continuing on his way. The look in her pupilless, solid-colored eyes told him this was no accident. "Tidus Antirrhinum," Tidus offered, holding out a hand. "Nice to meet you." "Dasha," the girl said. She grabbed his hand briefly, then let it go like she was tossing it away. "So, do you always dress like you're going to a snooty gala, or is that just to look cool on your first day?" What?" Tidus asked, glancing down at himself. Sure, he was dressed formally. He hadn't changed out of what he had worn to Kyun's ceremony. But what had she just called it? Snooty? Dasha was wearing plain black leggings and a form-fitting black tank top. No shoes. The only accessories were 2 straps across her chest, the hilt of her dagger just visible over her shoulder, where they met in the back. Dasha herself was visibly lean and compact, built out of muscle. Tidus suddenly felt self-conscious about his own lack of athleticism. "I mean," Dasha said, leaning forward in response to his question. She got so close her ebony hair brushed Tidus' cheek as she pinched the flowy fabric of his sleeve between 2 fingers and gave a little tug. She smelled like charcoal. Heat rushed into Tidus' face at the personal intrusion, and he looked away. "Do you plan on dressing to impress every day, or are you gonna chill out?" "Oh, well, this was just—" Tidus stammered, carefully pulling his arm free of her grasp and stepping back. "I don't dress like this every day, no." "Oh, thank Prometheus," Dasha sighed, leaning dramatically against the wall with one hand over her forehead. I don't think I could stomach having 2 prissy princes around. 2? Tidus asked. Who else is there? How many other students are here? You make 3 of us for now, Dasha said. Tavarius is already in bed. He's a real drag. Not afraid to let you know if he thinks he's better than you, you know. I can't stand the guy. Tidus grimaced. He had definitely met people like that before, but he felt like if he mentioned that to Dasha, considering he had met those people at actual galas, it probably wouldn't win him any points. And even more than being an intimidatingly beautiful girl who could probably beat him to a pulp with one hand tied behind her back. She was a fellow Timecaster, another future Omni Tempore. He might not have figured out all the social rules of this place yet, but one thing was a constant. From politicians to soldiers to criminals, the people you were going to make your career with were the people you had to make nice with, above all else. Now, more than ever, that was a matter of survival. So, how long have you been here, studying? Tidus asked. He wanted to get to his room and sleep. His entire body ached with exhaustion. But first impressions only came around once. At least Dasha was easier to talk to than Muse. Like a month, Dasha said, and prepare yourself. It's a lot. Well, all right. You look like you've been to a real school, so maybe it'll seem normal to you, but whatever. I guess they're trying to cram as much useful stuff into us as they can before the first trial. Tidus frowned, his hand brushing absently against the still foreign presence of the dagger at his hip. Dasha's glinted at him over her shoulder, a reminder that, as friendly as they might become, they were also mortal threats to each other. Fun. Trial? He asked. Dasha's green eyes sparkled, and she grinned, flashing her sharp canines. Oh, yeah, I forgot. Muse isn't into explanations, Dasha said with a laugh. Well, there's like 5 trials, I think, before you graduate from training. I haven't figured out what they all are yet, but they're supposed to be really hard and dangerous. Apparently, a ton of trainees don't even survive. But how? Tidus asked, his frown deepening. The only way he knew that they could die was by killing each other. All 5 trials couldn't just be fights to the death, could they? I mean, what kind of test can that even be? I have no idea. Dasha sounded way too thrilled about the possibility of death. She bounced on the balls of her feet like a child at a carnival. Anyway, I'll let you get settled in. Can't wait to try sparring you. She brushed past Tidus, punching him in the shoulder as she went, and then she was gone before Tidus could formulate a response. His stomach twisted. Sparring. As much as he should have seen that coming, it still blindsided him. And Dasha could definitely pummel him. He wished he could make everything stop, to give himself a moment to catch up. Tidus sighed. Only a few more steps down the hall, he found the room with his name displayed on the designation screen. He swiped the door open and stepped in. To his immense relief, his luggage had already been brought in and lined up neatly next to the closet. Besides that, there was a bed, a desk, and he could see an adjoining bathroom. It was small but not cramped, and it would offer some privacy. At least it wasn't a communal dorm. Tidus stripped off his formal wear in exchange for silken pajamas and flopped down onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. The adrenaline that had been keeping him going since he had first laid eyes on Muse started to drain out of his veins, and he grew sluggish, eyelids heavy. But his mind wouldn't stop working. Muse knew he had reset time more than once. She knew what he had done, and he wasn't in trouble for it. He wouldn't be in trouble for it. He ached to tell Ilaria, to put at ease any concerns she might be harboring. He would have to tell her the next time he saw her, whenever that might be. The fact that the symbolic membership for the Omni Tempore, the insignia of their loyalty and potential, was also a weapon specifically crafted to kill other Timecasters, sent an uneasy shiver through Tidus' bones. The way Muse had talked about it, it was equally unnerving. Pushing each other to be great, sure, that made sense, but keeping each other in check? Ensure that only the strongest, most worthy would serve the Empire? That definitely sounded like at least one of the trials might be a fight to the death. Hopefully not the first one, at least. Tidus felt like he was drowning with everything that had happened. He couldn't even tell how long it had been now, since time didn't work properly when it came to his experiences anymore. Was it really just this morning that he would have died? That he had died? Make sure it was worth it. Kyun's words haunted him, pulling to mind the hollow, cold disappointment in his brother's eyes when he had said them. Tidus rubbed his eyes with his palms. He would do it. It would be worth it. He would be worth it. And he would make Kyun understand that. Making him see that saving his life hadn't been wrong. He just had to survive the training, to learn enough that he could erase that look from Kyun's eyes, so that he could really get his brother back. Tidus didn't realize he had fallen asleep until he woke up screaming. Every nerve in his body shrieked with pain, memories of burning and melting flesh, of blood pouring from his neck, of water smothering him from within. Tidus grabbed his pillow and bit down, muffling his scream. His parents couldn't hear this. They couldn't know. No, he wasn't home, he realized with a start. He was on the Epoch's echo. Tidus bit down harder and squeezed his eyes shut against the tears leaking out. Every movement was agony, like swimming through broken glass. When he opened his eyes, he was surprised not to see any blood. Even though the rational part of him knew the pain was all in his mind, he didn't quite believe it until he saw his body fully intact, if shaking like a leaf. Tidus took a deep breath and held it in, then slowly let it out, over and over, until he got his heart to stop beating at a marathon pace. He was all right. He was alive. When he finally felt steady, he swung his feet over the edge of the bed. His hands were still shaking, maybe not as steady as he thought. A soft chime sounded, and the voice of Timothy, the ship's AI assistant, came from the speaker on the wall. "Good morning, Tidus," the AI intoned. "Your first lesson is scheduled to begin in 1 hour." "Oh, great, thank you," Tidus said, swallowing the sandpaper in his throat. Is there somewhere I can get breakfast first?" He shakily got to his feet as he spoke, and stumbled his way to his luggage. Timothy responded, his tone always not quite cheerful, giving Tidus directions to the dining room while Tidus pulled out a set of clothes and headed into the shower. The hot water at least helped him center himself and shake away most of the residual phantom pains of death. He really hoped those wouldn't keep going for too long. He was going to lose his voice if he woke up screaming every day. He prayed that the first lesson in his training would be about how to get rid of phantom deaths and nightmares. When he made it to the dining room, Dasha was already there, and so was the other boy she had complained about the previous night. The boy had long ears and wispy red hair that floated around his head like a mane. It was hard to gauge how old he was. Elves aged so ridiculously slowly that most people Tidus knew didn't even try to guess. "Good morning," Tidus said. He scanned the room quickly before choosing a seat. There didn't seem to be much of a rule about where people should sit. Dasha was at the head with her feet on the singular long table, which was enough indication for Tidus that he could sit wherever he wanted. He settled on across from the red-headed elf, so he wasn't too close to anyone, but close enough not to be rude either. Dasha was dressed the same way she had been the night before, and still wasn't wearing shoes. Tavarius, on the other hand, was dressed in something startlingly similar to Tidus' formal outfit. The green tunic had a stiff, high collar, and a perfectly tailored fit around the waist. The sleeves were long and flared out around the wrists, not something Tidus would have worn to a meal of any formality. Too easy to get food on something like that. Tidus couldn't see where the elf was keeping his dagger, which set off a ripple of nerves under his skin. He had only had his for around 12 hours now, but it was already something he would only be caught dead without. Tavarius was either concealing his, which would mean Tidus was very glad he was sitting out of arm's reach, or Tavarius didn't have his dagger with him, which would mean he was an idiot. "I was starting to think you weren't even going to show up," Tavarius said, somehow seeming to look down his nose at Tidus, even though they were both sitting. Dasha flicked a grape at the elf's face, and he shot a scowl at her. "Just needed some extra sleep, I guess," Tidus said. I already met Dasha last night, but, well, I'm Tidus." "Tavarius," Tavarius responded, seemingly already bored with the conversation. Tidus was definitely not looking forward to having him as a classmate. "You could also call him Buzzkill," Dasha said in a stage whisper. Tidus smiled, and Tavarius shot her a withering look. "We may both be trainees here, but that does not put you on equal standing with me," Tavarius pronounced with a huff. Dasha laughed and stuffed a handful of berries into her mouth, chewing with a wide grin that showed off the juices splattered on her sharp teeth. "Actually," Tidus said, taking a plate for himself, "I rather think it does." He held back a scowl of irritation. Tavarius seemed to have a talent for being unlikable at first glance. "Oh, you think you know everything just because you're from the first forged planet?" Tavarius sniffed. Another jab at him based on the fact he was from Dothara. Tidus knew the heart of the Empire was merely a dream to the average citizen of the Empire. It spanned galaxies, after all. That was inevitable. But he had never expected this kind of reaction from people. He had never expected being from the center of civilization would make him feel like such an outsider. "Hardly," Tidus said, managing what he hoped was a pleasant smile. He knew people liked Tavarius, and showing weakness would be like spilling blood in shark-infested waters. "After all, I don't know anything about you two yet. Where are you from, Tavarius?" Tavarius' face flushed as bright as his hair, and he scrunched his nose. "I'll have you know I am from the House Risterion of the Rislin Nebula," Tavarius said, gripping his fork with a white-knuckled grip. House Risterion was a name Tidus recognized. A few of them had applied to the university in the past several years, and had been rejected. They were the ancestral leadership of a merchant clan. "I see," Tidus replied. "Well, I should apologize, then, for not introducing myself properly a moment ago." Tavarius' expression wavered, and he narrowed his eyes. "I am Tidus Antirrhinum, of the Antirrhinum House of Dothara," Tidus said, "4th House of the Silver Crown." Tavarius stared at him, visibly crumpling as he realized who Tidus was. He didn't like using his title to pull rank. It was classless and unnecessary, usually. But if Tavarius wanted to pick a fight, he should be prepared to lose. Dasha laughed so hard she fell out of her chair. Tavarius stood suddenly and left the room. Tidus had wanted to build bridges with both of them, if possible. But if he had to pick between the two, he would definitely pick Dasha. Chapter 10. Time, it seemed, did not bend willingly to the whims of mortals. Tidus had always been a quick study, but that wasn't enough. He took notes, memorized diagrams of time loops, paradoxes, and the splitting and converging of timelines. He woke up screaming nearly every morning, all 3 of his deaths replaying through his mind and body in vivid detail, sending echoes of pain through him for hours after he woke. Tidus memorized the theory, meditated every spare moment he had to try and connect with the flow of time. To sense it, it was everywhere, so why should it be so hard? But weeks had passed, and he had nothing to show for it. Tidus stood in the sparring ring, winded, sweat dripping down his nose. Dasha laughed from the other side of the ring. She was a natural fighter, light on her feet with reflexes like a viper, infuriatingly impressive. Over the past 4 months, Tidus had gotten stronger and faster, had committed every piece of information they were taught to memory. But he still ended up on the ground during every fight, and he couldn't call forth the power of timecasting. Dasha would blink around the sparring ring, appearing just out of reach of his strikes, popping up behind him when he tried to dodge. Compared to her, Tidus was nothing, less even than the redundancy he had been as the second son of his father. No matter how much work Tidus put in, he would never be able to compete if he didn't figure out how to use timecasting intentionally, and that would be the death of him. He would die a waste of blood, a waste of the Emperor's gift, and the universe wouldn't even miss him.
"Come on, Antirrhinum, not giving up on me, are you?"
Dasha teased, and then she was behind him. Tidus spun around and barely blocked her fist as it headed for his ribs, deflecting it against his forearm. His pulse pounded in his ears. Dasha spun gracefully out of reach, trailing shimmering gold behind her. Tidus blinked, and the golden image was gone. Was he seeing things, or had that been real? It had felt for just a moment like he was back in the timescape, the sandy particles filling the air. He hoped it wasn't just wishful thinking, or too many knockdowns getting to him. He focused, trying to summon the memory of what he had seen, how it had felt. It had been so fleeting, but he had to grab onto it. It was something, the first glimpse of something he had experienced since he had started his training. Dasha's foot slammed into his ribcage and sent him flying, landing him flat on his back and gasping for air. Hot pain wrapped around his torso, squeezing like tentacles. Tidus sucked in a breath of air and held on to what he had felt. Faint, but familiar. Something like sand, but not quite.
"Are you even paying attention?"
Dasha asked.
"How can you expect to ever beat me if you're distracted?"
Tidus sat up. His ribs screamed at the movement, but he got to his feet, ignoring the pain. He grabbed onto the feeling he had identified and poured all of his energy into it, into perceiving what was there, perceiving the glittering particles of time itself. The room around him exploded into grainy images, like old pixelated film from pre-space travel records, or sand sculptures in motion, glittering with golden sunlight. Images of Dasha and himself flicked around the room. Tidus turned his gaze to the present version of Dasha, who was splitting into 3 as he watched. The real one and 2 shimmering mirages made of sandy particles, sending a spike of pain through his skull. Dasha grinned and leapt at him, sending her fist directly towards his face. Tidus saw the pre-image of it composed out of the sandy particles and managed to dodge, just in time for the real thing to miss him by inches. The sudden movement, combined with the swirling of the time particles around him, sent another spike of pain through his head, whiting out his vision. There were so many details, so many moments on display, all rushing into his mind at once. Tidus doubled over and vomited on the floor of the arena. The grainy images around him vanished, leaving him with only the present moment. Dasha stepped backwards, away from him. "Gross," she said. Tidus grimaced and wiped the sick from his mouth. His stomach churned, and his vision was still splotchy from the pain overwhelming his mind. But underneath all of that was a euphoric current of victory. He had finally done it. He had accessed the flow of time, and even if it was just for a moment, he had used timecasting. Even now, he could feel the hum of the flow of time all around him, just within his reach. A slow clap started from behind him, and Tidus turned and landed his gaze on Muse, watching from her place leaning against the wall. Her expression was neutral, but for the slightest twitch at one corner of her mouth.
"I was starting to wonder if you would ever catch up," she said. "Well, Antirrhinum, you've got 7 weeks left until your first trial. You'll want to be able to do that without throwing up. Get out of the ring so we can clean that up."
She turned and swept out of the room. Dasha skipped past him, punching him in the shoulder with a congratulatory grin on her way. Tidus flashed her a brief smile, but it vanished as soon as she wasn't looking. The deadline Muse had given him burned like a hot coal in his stomach. 7 weeks. It had taken him 4 months to make even the smallest ounce of progress, the briefest moment of successful timecasting. And now he had only 7 weeks before the first trial, before his ability to use timecasting would mean life or death. Tidus made his way back to his room, fatigue wriggling through his limbs and dragging him down. On his desk, his comm screen flashed with a notification, a letter from Ilaria. Tidus smiled and opened it up, scanning through her erratically composed recounting of her week. Ilaria had been writing to him at least once a week, sometimes much more, ever since he had left. He always carved out a few minutes to write back, even on the days when he was the most exhausted. She was worth it. His parents' letters had been regular, coming in once every week at the same time. Only Kyun had been silent. Tidus pulled up Kyun's contact and started a message to him. He hesitated. Maybe Kyun just needed more time. Trying to force it might make things worse, and it wasn't like Tidus had anything that great to report yet. "Hey, Kyun, I finally managed to use timecasting for 2 seconds, and threw up right after. Isn't that amazing?" Tidus shook his head and closed the message without writing a word. Tidus let out a slow breath and sat on the floor, crossing his legs under him. He rolled his shoulders and relaxed them. Kyun would reach out to him. He wouldn't cut him off entirely. He just needed to give his brother time. A few more weeks, Tidus was sure. There was no way he would keep up the silent treatment past Tidus' 17th birthday. That would be, based off of Muse's timeline, only days before the first trial. Tidus focused on the feeling of the flow of time around him, pulling the particles back into his vision. He focused on the image of himself, standing at the comm screen, then walking backwards until he disappeared out the door. It thrust the pain in his head back to the forefront, a throbbing headache demanding to be noticed. Tidus pushed past it. He had to build up his stamina for timecasting. He had to be able to use it without being debilitated, because when Kyun finally did speak to him again, he needed to have a good report. He needed to be able to show his brother that it had been worth it. To do that, he would have to survive the trials. Tidus couldn't afford to just scrape by. He had to be the best. He would be someone his family could be proud of, someone worthy of Ilaria's unwavering faith. But only if he survived long enough to earn that, and he was running out of time. Chapter 11. Tidus turned 17 3 days before the Epoch's Echo arrived at the planet of Scarlon. His parents had written to him, and so had Ilaria. Kiun maintained his silence. It stung more than Tidus had expected, but he tried his best to forgive his brother. He hadn't done anything to earn back Kiun's trust or approval. He hadn't proven himself yet. The day would come. He just had to make it there. At least Tidus had improved in his ability to use timecasting. As difficult as it had been to grasp, it was incredible to behold. Like there was an entire other world layered on top of the one he had always lived in. And now he could see it. He could touch it. The closer they had gotten to Scarlon, the more Tidus and the other two pupils had tried to wheedle out details from Muse. Anything that could help them during the first trial. But she was a fortress. All they knew was that they would be going to the surface of Scarlon, and she had advised them to dress in sturdy clothing. So it reasoned the trial would be more physical than academic. A quick scan through Scarlon's data file showed they would be landing in a tropical region with massive vegetation, a jungle on a scale not found anywhere on Dothara proper. Tidus put on his most weather-worthy boots and clothes that were thick but not too absorbent. The sleeves of his shirt were long but not close-fitting. That should offer him protection from the sun without being too smothering. Dasha had different ideas, apparently, or maybe she didn't own any clothes with sleeves to begin with. He'd only ever seen her in tank tops the entire 6 months they had trained together. At least she had elected to wear shoes. Tidus hadn't been sure she owned any of those for the first 3 weeks. Tavarius was wearing some kind of padded body armor, and was clearly quite proud of his decision, despite how the shoulder pads made him look like a baby turtle sticking its head out of its shell for the first time. "All right," Muse said, clapping her hands together as she led them on to the shuttle. It was the same one that had originally picked up Tidus from Dothara. "First trial time. If you've prepared, congratulations. You might survive. Otherwise, at least I won't have to deal with you any more." "Now that we're here," Dasha said as soon as the shuttle detached from the Epoch's Echo, "can you tell us more about the trial itself?" "Here's the deal," Muse said. "During your training, you'll be taught a lot of things. But the Omni Tempore has no use for people who only learn what's given to them. The trials are times for you to show that you can figure things out on your own, and do what it takes to get the job done. So, we will never tell you how to pass a trial, or what you need to do to survive it. Got it?" Dasha wrinkled her nose at this answer and nodded, saying nothing else. Tidus watched Muse. She, in return, was watching them all, carefully, expectantly. There was more to this. Muse liked giving half-answers, or adjacent information, to see what they would do with it. "All right, so don't tell us how to pass," Tidus said after a moment. "What can you tell us about the trial?" A dangerous grin crept onto Muse's face. "When we get to the surface of Scarlon, I will send all 3 of you backwards in time," she explained. "Farther back than you've ever been. Probably farther back than you'll ever go again, to be honest. You know the basics of timecasting now. Or you should. I'll wait for you for 2 weeks. She leaned back in her chair, twining her fingers behind her head and watching the recruits absorb this information. The iridescent scales along her scalp reflected the shuttle lights in bright flashes every time she moved. Cold ribbons of panic wrapped around Tidus' heart, but he tried to keep most of his fear off his features. All the progress he had made was a grain of sand compared to a desert in the face of this trial. Tavarius furrowed his brow, no doubt reviewing every lesson he'd had since arriving at the Epoch's Echo. Dasha's eyes widened and flickered from Muse to Tidus to Tavarius and back.
Wait, so we have to figure out how to jump forward in time? How far back are you sending us? A few millennia, Muse said with a shrug. Dash's eyes almost fell out of her head, and Tidus felt his mouth fall open. He closed it quickly and swallowed hard. Even Tavarius looked nervous now. Thousands of years. She was going to throw them back thousands of years, and they had to figure out how to get back and land within a 2-week window. The largest time jumps they had studied had been on the scale of months, not centuries or millennia, not even years. Tidus' gaze flickered between his two fellow students. Dasha and Tavarius both had at least a month more of training than he did, and all of them had at least unlocked 1 or 2 time-casting abilities. He was definitely less than thrilled to be working with Tavarius. The boy had become increasingly insufferable, as Tidus had attempted to get to know him. But as poor of company as he was smart and crafty. And Tidus figured he would probably have to work with people he disliked at some point. Might as well start now. This entire thing sounded like the exact kind of situation during which he would want Dasha watching his back, so all in all they had a pretty good chance. They were all new and relatively inexperienced, but Tidus had studied enough of the time-casting runes that they could probably combine their powers. That might give them the boost they needed to get back. Killing themselves wouldn't work, and Tidus wasn't sure if he was relieved about that or not. It would be the simple answer, but he hated the thought of doing it. Again. Their anchor points, the spots they would reset to, moved forward with them automatically, like an instinct, until they learned to control it. And when you went back farther than a week, your reset point went with you. The sound of a chime broke him out of his thoughts, and Muse led them off the shuttle with a sweeping swish of her robes. Tidus was running through every timeline diagram he had memorized, trying to remember any hint of how to go forward instead of back. The only time he could recall it being mentioned was as a warning. Jumping into the future was possible, but it wasn't useful. You wouldn't know what the future was going to look like. The bigger benefit of time-casting was to be able to change the present and manipulate the past. Tidus put his hands in his pockets to keep his fingers from twitching, and managed to be the first one behind Muse. Dasha practically skipped behind him. He wondered, not for the first time, how she never seemed to be affected by things. Nothing ever threw her off or got her down. She just laughed at any obstacle she came across and found a way to backflip over it. He envied her the skill. Dasha was the kind of person who could walk into a room and be instantly liked and respected. She didn't have to work for it. She had charisma and charm. Tidus would kill to just have a fraction of that. Tidus scanned the area around them as he followed Muse to a glass alloy bridge that turned into a spiraling ramp leading to ground level. The area was sparsely populated, from the looks of it. The buildings had the appearance of something temporary and modular, almost like the entire town could pick up and move on a whim. The town itself was nestled between the mountains that scraped against the feathery clouds overhead. As they descended through the glass spiral, the mountains were obscured by dense vegetation. Tidus spotted several trees with leaves bigger than his entire body. The settlement seemed to have made every effort to drop into this space without moving so much as a twig to make room for themselves. The air around them grew more suffocating the lower they went, and Tidus was quickly regretting his choice in clothing. It was like the air itself was sweating, coating him in a film of moisture he couldn't escape. He grimaced. At the bottom of the glass spiral, Muse stood at the center of an intricate rune map painted in gold in a series of concentric time-casting mandalas on the stone. This area was clear of vegetation in every place the runes reached.
Muse gestured to the edge of the clearing.
"Take your places."
6 time mandalas ringed the edge with nothing in their centers. Tidus exchanged glances with Dasha, and they each moved to stand in one of the vacant circles. This was it, his first real test, the first true hurdle he had to get over. And according to what Muse had said, he would come out of it with a far better grasp of time casting, if he came out of it at all. There were 5 trials, but right now this was the only one that mattered. Tidus clenched his fists and set his jaw. He would show Kyun that he could make up for his failures. He could be exactly what Ilaria believed him to be. Muse raised her hands, and the time particles coalesced around them, spiraling outwards towards each of the recruits. Tidus barely had to focus to really see the time particles. He had gotten better at it, but Muse used so much power, he wouldn't be surprised if the sand was visible even to non-timecasters. Muse slammed her hands to the ground, sending out a shockwave. The sand rushed towards them, like the sandstorms back home, but it never hit him. Instead of stinging his eyes and biting his skin, it flowed over Tidus, like it was wrapping him in a cocoon of time. Then the sand hardened, suddenly turning into a glassy prism around him. He held his breath. All he could see was his own reflection 100 times over from every angle. 100 versions of himself. It was strange, alien, but somehow also right. Everything about the ritual felt like an extension of himself. A crack appeared in front of him, and just as he turned his gaze to look at it, the entire cocoon shattered around him and fell away. Tidus blinked at the return of sunlight and looked around. The air was still thick and hot, but the glass spiral was gone. The runes and buildings, too. And so were Dasha and Tavarius. Tidus felt his stomach drop. He called their names, running to the places he had last seen the other 2 students as the truth crashed down on him. They weren't there. Of course they weren't. They had to pass the trials by themselves, on their own merit. Muse had all of history to send them back to. There was no reason they would be together. The daggers had been the first clue, and those were handed out on day 1. Becoming Omni Tempore was not a cooperative venture. Tidus was alone. Chapter 12. Tidus put his hands to his knees, leaning over to breathe through the wave of panic. He was alone, completely, entirely, and utterly alone. There would be no one to rely on, no one to talk to, not until he figured out a way back, on his own. It wasn't just Dasha and Tavarius that weren't there. There was no sapient life native to Scarlawn. Of course, that's exactly the kind of planet they would choose for this kind of trial. To make sure, the prospective Timecasters had to figure things out without help. But how long would that take? Tidus almost laughed at the thought. It didn't matter to Muse how long it might take. His return would be back to the same window, no matter how much time passed for him in the meantime in this current era. He could potentially finish this trial as an old man, if he survived that long. That idea jarred Tidus out of his thoughts, and he straightened, straining his eyes and ears for hints of danger in the surrounding forest. He didn't even know what kinds of animals might live here in whatever time period he'd been dropped into. Tidus furrowed his brow and focused, pulling the flow of time particles into his field of vision. He adjusted back and forth between hindsight and foresight, checking as far as he could in both directions. Looking more than a few minutes either way gave him a headache, But at least he knew he had those minutes of safety without being ambushed by a bloodthirsty predator. With the time particles overlaying his vision, he could see the ripples caused by the passage of insects, small animals, and even birds overhead. A few larger sets of tracks came into view as he pushed farther back. Hindsight was easier than foresight. He could already stretch himself to see hours in the past, and it revealed a tapestry of life that inhabited the jungle. The place he found himself in was a hunting ground when night fell. Tidus swallowed hard. He would have to find somewhere to hide when that happened, unless by some miracle he managed to pass this trial in less than a day. Tidus turned to look for some place in which to shelter, then froze. The settlement Muse would be waiting for him in was small. He didn't know exactly how small, but it wouldn't be hard for him to leave the perimeter of it without noticing. With the heavy jungle covering the mountains, it would be a simple thing to get completely lost out here. He was not about to be the idiot that figured out how to pass the trial, only to be so ridiculously lost that he died in the present-day jungle. Tidus took his golden knife from its sheath and let out a slow breath. It was basically all he had to work with, so this would be fine, right? Not disrespectful or blasphemous. The dagger was symbolic and ceremonial, sure, not usually the kind of thing he would consider a survival tool, but they must have anticipated this use by giving it to them before the trial. Tidus prayed that he was right, as he raised the blade and carved deep grooves into the tree in front of him. He cut through the bark, then the wood, until he had a rough approximation of a star. Now, once he figured out how to get back to the right time, he would just have to find this tree. Getting back to the tree could still be tricky if he got lost, but at least he would know when he found it. Tidus shook his head and scanned the area, checking for danger in the next several minutes. Then he blinked and switched back to hindsight. His own form materialized and walked towards him. Tidus closed his eyes and resisted the urge to bash his own head against the tree. He didn't need to carve a stupid star into a tree at all. He would always be able to find this place if he just followed his own past self. Feeling like a complete idiot, and glad at least no one was around to witness it, Tidus set to work finding somewhere defensible to make camp. Chalky powder coated Tidus' fingers and dusted his lips. It covered every inch he could reach of the walls and ceiling of the cave he had staked his claim in. The bright green rocks Tidus wrote with littered the surrounding mountainside. The section nearest the door was where he marked his calendar, more for his own sanity than really needing to keep track of the days. 129 of them so far. The ceiling above where he slept was marked with a star chart from the night sky back home. All the major constellations, except for the bright purple Eye of Ling. He could still see that one in Scarlon's sky. It was the only star you could see from anywhere in the Empire. Tidus had taken that for granted before, but the constant vigil of it was more comforting than he would ever be able to express. The gaze of the Emperor, watching over everything. Galaxies and millennia away from home, isolated from every other living soul, the Eye still kept watch over him. The rest of his chalk markings were much more relevant to his actual task. He had copied down everything he could remember from his 6 months of lessons, everything he knew or had discovered about time casting, and some passages of scripture he had thought might be helpful. He had even made several attempts at recreating the complicated timeline and multiverse maps they had drilled into him, but those did not lend themselves to two-dimensional depictions. More than 4 months spent alone in the past, and he could only pretend he had made any progress. His dark hair had grown long and matted. tied back with a scrap of one of his mangled sleeves to keep it out of his face. His shirt barely qualified as an article of clothing at this point. Only his boots were making an effort to withstand the test of time. Tidus crushed his bit of chalk in his fist. Every day was another tally mark of failure. He was better now at using foresight and hindsight, pushing his limits further every day. He could even slide himself backwards a few seconds, once even a whole minute, but none of that brought him any closer to figuring out how to go forward again, especially not on the scale he needed. Time resisted his push and pull at every turn, like it was fighting him for control. Tidus ran his hand over the sheath of his knife and left the cave. Too much time inside made it hard to breathe, the knowledge he had gained in his training running through his mind endlessly and never helping. He needed to get more food anyway. The fruit ripened quickly once it was picked, and the few animals he had hunted had caused him days of agonizing pain and delirium after cooking and eating them, so he had stuck to plant life after that. He had managed to maintain a decent water supply, collecting rainwater in basins he'd molded from clay and insulated with the rubbery leaves of the whip-thin trees that grew a little ways up the mountainside. Tidus cycled through hindsight and foresight constantly, checking his surroundings to stay ahead of dangerous predators. He needed the practice either way. He had to figure out how to get out of here. He lingered on foresight, even as the headache creeped in, trying once again to grab onto something, to pull himself into the future. But it was like trying to get a grip on a sand dune. Futile and exhausting. An hour into his foraging, a trickle of blood from his nose convinced Tidus to stop pushing foresight for now. He cut down a cluster of fruits from a tree, and then froze. A feeling crept over him, starting between his shoulders and spreading over his entire body. He was being watched, followed, hunted. Tidus pushed his foresight again, the nosebleed starting up in earnest immediately, but he found nothing. Nothing that he could see or sense with foresight or hindsight, at least not within the next few minutes. But the feeling of danger remained. Tidus kept his guard up and made a circuitous route back to his cave. He moved slowly, constantly checking for danger. By the time he made it back to his base, a heavy air of wrongness permeated everything. His base wasn't much, and it appeared identical to the way he had left it as far as he could tell. The chalk drawings were undisturbed, and his water supply was still present. Tidus sucked in a breath and activated hindsight. Time particles materialized around the cave. A jolt of shock ran through him as he watched the unfamiliar figure, shorter than him, features hidden by a flowing cloak, enter the cave. They sorted through his food and pocketed a few pieces. Then the figure pulled out a vial and a syringe and proceeded to inject its contents into the remaining food. Tidus felt his blood run cold, and he picked up the tampered food and flung it outside. A freezing sweat beaded on his forehead, even in the oppressive humidity of the jungle. Someone else was here, another person. They knew where he was living. The memory of the syringe made him shudder. Whoever it was safe to assume they were trying to kill him, or worse. Tidus felt bile rise in his throat and swallowed the urge to be sick. For more than 4 months, the only dangers he had had to worry about were the indifference of the environment, predators with a hunter's instinct, and his own potential mistakes. Why was there an assassin stalking him now? Was this part of the trial? Some kind of test? Maybe if he took longer than they thought should be necessary, the Omni Tempore sent someone to eliminate him. Tidus shook his head and chided himself. Whatever the enigmatic stranger had contaminated his food with couldn't actually kill him. It would just cause him to start the day over if it was poison. Besides, there should be no such thing as taking too long for this trial. The amount of time Muse would wait would be the same even if he spent years in the past. No. Whoever was here, chances were they had nothing to do with the Omni Tempore. So who were they, and how did they get here? Tidus was thousands of years in the past. Was this person from the past, or had they originated from the same time as him? He wished he knew how to tell what time period they came from for certain. Sure, with enough practice he would be able to, but right now all time signatures looked the same. Tidus activated hindsight again, watching the figure enter the cave, take a few pieces of food, and then poison the rest. The images from hindsight were always somewhat grainy, being composed of sand-like particles, but he had never felt like they were so lacking in detail before. This person had taken pains to keep their face shrouded beneath the drooping hood of their cloak, almost like they knew he would be able to see this. That was a terrifying thought. How much did they know about him, or were they just cautious? Their clothing, at least, seemed to be from the same era as Tidus. He could make out the blurry image of a logo on the clasp of the cloak, easily recognizable as one of the most common brands in the Empire. And they had completely ignored all the writing that covered the interior of the cave. Even if it was meaningless to them, Tidus would have expected a passing notice, taking some amount of time to try and decipher the meaning of the drawings. Instead, they had gone straight to his food, efficient and focused. They had disturbed so little that, without hindsight, Tidus wouldn't have noticed they had ever been here at all. A tremor of alarm shuddered in Tidus' chest, and he swallowed it down. His objective was the same. He still had to stay alive long enough to pass the trial. He had to get back to his own time, to earn his place with the Omni Tempore, to get back to Ilaria, to prove to Kiun that he had done the right thing, that his life wasn't a waste. The staying alive part had just gotten a little more complicated, that was all. Now, there was someone who apparently wanted him, specifically, dead. Tidus gripped the hilt of his dagger tightly. He wasn't about to sit around and wait to be hunted. No, he wouldn't be able to focus enough to get out of here if he chose to live in fear of this person. Startling at the smallest sounds, waiting to be picked off. He would just get himself killed that way. The familiar weight and mysterious warmth of the dagger spread up his arm and through his body. The knife had proven useful in many ways since he had gotten stuck in this time. He knew very well the blade was still wickedly sharp. Tidus Antirrhinum was far from helpless. Chapter 13. Tidus crouched on the thick tree branch, hands now calloused enough the bark didn't bite into his palm. The buzzing of insects was nearly deafening this high up in the trees. Tidus had only gotten snatches of sleep for the past 8 days, no more than an hour at a time, but he had finally figured out how his would-be killer was avoiding him. They hadn't been traveling on the ground at all, so he could never detect their tracks on the jungle floor. Rather, they had been flitting through the canopy as easily as if they had wings. They did not, as far as Tidus could tell, actually have wings, but it was impossible to nail down any other concrete details about them. Every time he caught sight of them with hindsight, they seemed inconsistent. If they were climbing, their hands looked strangely distorted, sometimes their feet as well, and their shoes would be missing. He knew it was the same person. He had learned to recognize their time signature. But between sightings, even their stature seemed to change. Some days they would be tall, some days short and slim. It made Tidus uneasy. Whoever they were, whatever they were unpredictable. That made them all the more dangerous. Tidus caught himself chewing his lip and stopped. He could feel himself wearing down, exhaustion seeping into his bones after every attempt at getting rest. He was weary, losing his edge. He couldn't keep this up and survive. Running away, avoiding his mysterious enemy wasn't sustainable. He had to find them, eliminate them. He would never figure out how to get back to the correct time if he was sleep-deprived and paranoid. If he was going to fail this trial, it wouldn't be because he let some stranger kill him. He knew he could only keep up the chase for maybe another 2 days before he was completely delirious, so he needed to end it soon. Tidus pulled out his knife and carved a symbol into the tree branch he was crouched on, slowly, methodically, making sure each line of the rune was exact. Luckily, even though back on the Epoch's Echo he hadn't been able to reliably channel timecasting, he had memorized every rune he'd been taught. Now he would be able to put that knowledge to use. He had already marked the trees around him, creating a carefully arranged circle of runes. Once activated, they would form a massive timecasting mandala. Anyone trapped inside would be frozen in a time loop, at least for as long as Tidus could keep it up. He would have to act quickly once the trap was sprung. Like a snare trap a hunter would use, but this one couldn't be used against him, except by a fellow timecaster. He bit his lip. The assassin's presence meant there had to be another timecaster involved, and yet he had seen no signs of timecasting from the assassin themselves. Added on to that, their time signature showed they did not carry a dagger capable of killing him permanently. The bright white time signature of his own knife was impossible to miss. Now, all he had to do was get close enough to the assassin to bait them and lure them into the trap. Simple in method, but in practice, it was the most dangerous part of the plan. He had put himself within killing distance, dying distance. The memories of his previous 3 deaths still haunted him, whispering at the edges of his consciousness, louder and louder, the more tired he became. Even if this person couldn't permanently kill him, which he hoped was true, he really didn't want to die more than he had to. He didn't need to add another nightmare to his roster. Tidus sheathed his knife and pulled on the time around him, activating foresight and hindsight in turn, scanning for traces of the assassin. He followed the branch he was on to an intersection with another, and made his way through the canopy until he picked up their trail. Hindsight showed a slowly fading set of footsteps, not too far ahead of him, minutes away. Tidus quickened his pace, following the memory of the footprints as they grew more recent. When the prints were within a minute of the present, Tidus slowed, carefully scanning around himself for signs of the assassin. The sounds of the jungle around him seemed to intensify, every rustle of vegetation and skittering of insects setting his teeth on edge. He flickered between foresight and hindsight rapidly, but saw no sign of the assassin approaching. They weren't coming to attack him, at least not in the next 2 minutes. Tidus frowned, following the hindsight footsteps. They were getting farther away. No, that wasn't it. He traced the path. They had gone around him? "What are you thinking?" Tidus muttered, carefully tracking the prints back towards where he had laid the trap. His heart stuttered. Would he actually get lucky? Was the assassin going to walk right into the place he needed to lure them? He couldn't let his guard down. He gripped the hilt of his dagger to ground himself, a tingle of hope sparking in his chest. This just might work. Finally, Tidus caught sight of them. For the first time in days, he saw the assassin in the present, instead of as a grainy afterimage of timecasting. They perched on a branch as easily as a monkey native to the jungle. Their cloak fluttered around them, obscuring most of their frame, but Tidus could see their hands. They held a sharp, leaf-shaped blade, and as he watched, they gouged a jagged line through one of his runes. Tidus bit back a yell and clamped his jaw shut. They were trying to destroy the trap, which meant they recognized the symbols. They knew too much about timecasting. He had laid enough runes he could afford a few losses. There would still be enough to trap them. It could still work, as long as he sprung it soon. Tidus scrambled to get within reach of one of his markings. He had to touch it to activate it, to ensnare the assassin. He held his breath and flinched at every shift of bark or leaves. He needed to hurry before they destroyed too many of the runes or fled out of range. Tidus glanced back to where the assassin was.
"Ah, there you are."
A voice in his ear made Tidus jump back, nearly falling from the branch. The figure had somehow caught up to him in a matter of seconds. Now they were perched 30 feet away, blade held casually in one hand. He could finally see their face in full detail. They looked almost human, but something about every feature was strange, uncanny. Large gray eyes were framed by deep blue hair with leaves, flower petals, and feathers braided into it. The face looked young, except for the hardness in the expression and the intensity in their gaze. Tidus barely had a moment to take it in, to draw his knife, before they leapt at him, blade flashing. Tidus stumbled to catch himself as he dodged, his foot slipping on the edge of the branch. His heart pounded in his ears.
"That was a pretty clever trick."
The assassin grinned.
"Probably would have worked on almost anyone else."
Tidus gritted his teeth and raised his knife, just managing to block their next attack. The impact rattled his bones, and his arm went almost entirely numb. He swapped his knife to the other hand and backed up. They were too fast. He couldn't track the attacks, see where they were going, keep track of his own footing and fight. It was all he could do to keep from falling, to stay on the branches and avoid plummeting 50 feet to the jungle floor. If he could get them to the ground somehow, he might have a chance. His foot scraped against the bark of the branch he was on, and a tingle shot up his leg. The runes. He was touching one of them. His trap could still work. He pulled at the timecasting power, coalescing it around him and throwing it out to reach the remaining runes. Most of them were still intact. He could do this. The power shifted around him, then a blinding force of information flashed through his mind. He grimaced, then gasped. A coldness began in his chest, and he couldn't breathe. The timecasting faded from his vision, and he saw the assassin standing 10 feet away from him, but with a solemn expression, the weapon in their hand. They still held it, but the handle had extended, telescoping out with such force it must have been spring-loaded. The leaf-shaped blade was buried deep into his chest, directly into his heart. Tidus dropped his dagger, hands weakly grabbing at the shaft of the weapon. It was slick with blood, and his hands came away covered. The blood dripped down his body as everything turned cold, from the tips of his fingers to his very core. Tidus looked up at his attacker as they jerked back the weapon, ripping it free of his chest. He wheezed at the pain, like they had torn out his very heart. A wave of blood surged from the wound, and Tidus swayed. The weapon came forward again, this time gently pushing against him, so he tilted back and toppled off the branch. Tidus closed his eyes. He hit the jungle floor with a heavy thud, bones shattering and blood pooling around him, and Tidus died for the 4th time. Chapter 14. Tidus woke in the timescape, gasping like he'd had the wind knocked out of him. His hands clutched at his chest, fingers searching for the gaping wound, but found nothing but the thick weave of the silky robe. Tidus sat up, coughing and gasping, whole body shaking. He had, somewhat naively he knew, hoped that the training and experience would make dying again at least a little easier. The screaming pain in his chest told him that if that was the case, it was still far off. There was a difference, though, he could tell as he pushed himself to his feet. The pain was just as intense, and he had no doubt he would have another nightmare added to the rotation. But the timescape felt different this time, warmer, almost, except there was no real temperature here. "Welcome back," the familiar voice of his future self said. Tidus looked over and saw the older, taller version of himself, lounging on the sand like he was sunbathing, despite being fully clothed, and there being no sun in the timescape. "Want to talk about it?" Not Tidus asked. Tidus shook his head and rubbed his eyes. He was so tired, even while dead. "Don't I have to get out of here before I lose my mind?" "The time limit gets longer as you get better at it." Not Tidus sat up. "You'll get a feel for it. It's different for everyone, but for me it's kind of like the cleaner the air feels, the longer I have. Once it starts to feel like I'm breathing sand, I know I gotta go." "Won't it be the same for me, since I'm you?" Tidus inquired, noticing the feeling of his breath as he inhaled. It did feel different, but he couldn't remember feeling like he was breathing sand before. "We might both be Tidus Antirrhinum," Not Tidus said, "but we're from different timelines, so there's no guarantee about what'll feel the same." Tidus nodded. That made as much sense as he could expect it to. And there was that warmth. Maybe that was it. Maybe it would feel cold when his time was up. He would have to pay closer attention. "So how's your training going?" Not Tidus asked. Tidus' head snapped up, eyes widening. That was right. The older version of himself had gone through the same training. He wore the Omni Tempore robe. Well, both of them did, but it actually fit his older self. That meant he'd passed all the trials, right? He was someone Tidus could get actual, real help from. "I need your help," Tidus blurted out. He didn't know how long his time here would last, and he needed to make the most of it. "Please, I'm stuck in the first trial, and I can't figure it out. It's been almost 5 months already." He faltered. Was that longer than this other version of himself had taken? Should he be ashamed of how long it was taking? He wished he knew how long it usually took other people, so he had something to measure against. His concern must have been written all over his face by the way his other self looked at him. Or maybe he was easy to read because his future self was, well, himself. "Don't worry about how long it takes," Not Tidus consoled. "It took me more than a year to get past the first trial." "A year?" Tidus groaned, eyes widening. So he wasn't even halfway through the time it took. That's... "Hey, don't worry," Not Tidus said. "You have an advantage, remember? You have me. I didn't. Well, I didn't have an older me." "You didn't?" Tidus asked with a frown. "Why not?" "What, you think I'm here chatting with you on accident?" Not Tidus asked, cocking an eyebrow. "I decided to do this, kid." "Oh," Tidus said. I don't know. I guess I just thought it was some kind of overlapping death phenomenon, or timeline convergence effect. I hadn't thought about it too much, really." "You've had plenty else to occupy your mind," Not Tidus replied with a nod. A wave of pain hit Tidus, emanating out from the place he had been stabbed and knocking him backwards. Tidus cried out, gripping his chest. This place would be a lot more relaxing if he wasn't always dealing with the shockwaves of whatever had killed him. He wondered if it would be nicer if he died in some non-violent way, like poisoned in his sleep or something. Tidus shook his head. That was definitely not a helpful line of thinking. "There was someone else there," Tidus said once he had recovered his footing. He looked over at his older self. "During the trial, that's how I died. They killed me. Is that part of the test?" "No," Not Tidus answered slowly. "No, that's not a standard component of the trial. Do you know who it was?" "I saw them right before, well, you know," Tidus said, gesturing at his chest. "But I don't think they look like that all the time. They had gray eyes, blue hair. Usually they were pretty small, but they got taller when they needed to." "Oh?" Not Tidus tilted his head, waiting for Tidus to go on. "I think they were a Krellian shape-changer," Tidus concluded. "There's no way they would let me see their regular face." Not Tidus didn't say anything to that, letting Tidus process his thoughts at his own pace. Tidus was grateful for that, as long as they had a moment. His first visits to the timescape had been so rushed, so urgent, he had barely been able to absorb what his older self had said, or what it all meant. Now Tidus' mind churned through questions. How did they find me? I mean, they looked like they were from the future. Present. The time I'm from, anyway, Tidus said. Shouldn't the Omni Tempore have security to prevent this? I thought the trials were super secret. They are, Not Tidus agreed. Well, I can't answer that for you, but those are definitely the right questions. Okay, well, maybe I can hide a message, something that'll last to the right point in time, and they'll know the trial is being tampered with? Tidus said, pacing in the sand as the idea molded in his mind. No, wait, if I had done that, they wouldn't have let the tampering happen in the first place, because the warning would have already been there, right? This is complicated. What, time travel? You're just now noticing. Not Tidus teased, quirking a smile. But listen, kid, I wouldn't count on sending a message like that either way. I mean, yeah, it might not work, but that's not the only reason. Tidus stopped pacing and looked over at his older self. Something dark clouded Not Tidus' expression. What do you mean? Kid, you've seen the way the training is. It's tough, right? He said. And the trials, they're trials by fire. Not everyone survives. They're not supposed to. The truth is, they aren't there to teach you. The trials are to cull undesirables. Tidus pursed his lips at the phrasing. There was such a note of bitterness in his own future self's voice. It caught him off guard. Well, yeah, Tidus remarked slowly. Not everyone will be worthy of the Omni Tempore. Think about what that means, Not Tidus pressed. They're not going to protect you. Look, I want to help you. I want to prepare you for things I wasn't prepared for at all. Tidus, listen. Think. The Empire will not protect you. Tidus shifted farther away from his future self. This wasn't what they should be talking about. He needed to be figuring out a way not to get killed again, a way back to the present. And the tone with which his older self spoke, even though the words were true, almost felt treasonous. Look, we might not have much time left, so I'll try to help you with this trial, his older self said. But you need to start thinking about what kind of person you want to be, what kind of life you want. You're going to have to make a lot of hard choices soon, and you have to make sure they're decisions you can live with. I mean, it's not going to be easy the farther along you get. What are you talking about? Tidus asked, a cloud of unease settling over his shoulders. Have they told you about the ranking system yet, for the Omni Tempore? Tidus shook his head. He hadn't had time to worry about that in his rush to learn the basics. Once you finish the trials, once you become one of them, his older self explained, gesturing distastefully at the robes he wore. There's only one way to keep or increase your rank. The real reason they gave you that knife. Tidus glanced down at the dagger, the only thing he knew of that could permanently kill him, or another Timecaster. His mouth went dry, and he looked back up at his older self. Wait. To earn a rank in the Omni Tempore, you have to kill the one who holds that rank. Not Tidus said, his red eyes deadly serious. There are only 43 spots, never more. That's the only way to climb the ladder. Killing. And if you don't play the game, you just get killed for your spot. But why? Tidus stammered. His palms were slick with sweat. Because the Empire doesn't protect Timecasters. Not Tidus said, like he was trying to drive the point home. The Empire protects itself. We are just tools. Tidus clenched his fists. The faces of Dasha, Tavarius, and even Muse flashed through his mind. He didn't want to kill any of them, not even Tavarius, as horrible as he was to be around. He had always thought if he had to kill anyone, it would be the enemies of the Empire. Rogue Timecasters trying to make trouble, maybe. Criminals, villains, not his peers. You have to decide how much of your loyalty the Empire really deserves. Not Tidus pressed. They will turn you into a killer. If you step out of line, they'll kill your family. It can destroy you. Why are you saying this? Tidus swallowed the taste of bile. Even if all that, I can't leave. That's a death sentence. The Empire is everything. The Empire claims to be everything. Not Tidus corrected. And I know, right now you don't have a lot of options. But someday you will. You'll be strong enough to make a choice. You should be ready. I think I'm going to be sick, Tidus whispered. Make it quick, Not Tidus said. We need to get you past the first trial. You deserve to be prepared. When you decide what to do, just make sure it's worth it. Make sure it was worth it. The words of his brother melded with the words of his future self, and Tidus felt his lungs constrict. Kiun already didn't understand, already wouldn't speak to him, and Tidus hadn't killed anyone yet, except himself. How would he face his brother if he became a murderer? His own deaths haunted himself enough. Would killing other Timecasters add more nightmares to his sleepless nights? Tidus took a deep breath and straightened. He could feel a shift in the knot temperature. His time was running out. His future self might have wanted to prepare him, but it wouldn't matter if he couldn't get past the first trial. I'll figure it out. Thanks for the warning, he said. Now, we're almost out of time. Tell me what I need to do. Chapter 15. Tidus jolted awake, the pain in his chest a vice, the shattering of his bones burning through every nerve. He bit back a scream and opened his eyes as they watered with tears. He was wedged into the crook of a tree, the place he had snatched a few moments of sleep just before he had been killed in his trap. Tidus let out a slow breath, pushing against the memory of the blade in his chest, and pulled at the flow of time. There it was, falling farther and farther behind him, second by second, just like Not Tidus had promised, his anchor point, the marker for where he would reset when he died. Tidus' heart leapt, elation rushing through his veins. This was something he could work with, actual progress. He could move his temporal anchor point. Now that he could feel it, he could reach out to it and slide it along the thread of his own personal timeline, like a bead on a necklace. With a grip on that thread, he could get back to the present, as long as he didn't lose sight of it. Tidus climbed out of his spot in the tree. He knew better than to stay put in this jungle. Time is everywhere, always, and in constant motion, he muttered to himself, repeating the words Not Tidus had said to him just before he'd entered the water, and re-entered the flow of time, like a sea. Instead of trying to change the face of it, I should sail across it. I need to learn to adjust the sails. Not Tidus had chuckled and apologized for how complicated and metaphorical his explanations were, but it was at least something. Tidus flicked on hindsight and caught the assassin's trail, too close by. He gripped the hilt of his knife. The assassin was a looming darkness he couldn't ignore, even if he could pull himself back to the present. Because then the darkness would follow him. The assassin would still be lurking everywhere he went. Even more than a threat to himself, the assassin was a threat to the Empire. Targeting the Omni Tempore trials was a sinister sign. Whoever they really were, they were dangerous, and it was unlikely they worked alone. He couldn't ignore that. Tidus crept along the branches, following the trail of the assassin. He pushed away the anxiety-riddled thoughts about the ranking system his future self had told him about. The killing. He would have to think about it eventually. He would have to deal with that at some point. But he couldn't do that right now. Not if he didn't want the assassin to kill him again. Except, a sinister voice in the back of his head whispered, "Won't you already become a killer if you kill the assassin? You'll be a killer either way. What's the difference?" Tidus pushed the voice away. This was different. The assassin was trying to kill him, had already succeeded in killing him once, and was capable of untold harm and destruction. Yes, technically the other Timecasters would also be trying to kill him eventually, in theory, but that was different too. He would figure out exactly how later. Tidus pulled up foresight and caught a flash of movement. 30 seconds into the future. He jumped aside to a different branch, and in that moment, a concurrent, real, tangible version of the assassin leapt from above. They landed, blade digging into the branch he had just vacated. They looked up and locked eyes with him, cocking their head to the side.
"Oh, have we danced before?"
they asked. Their laugh sent a bead of cold slithering down his spine. "Who are you?" Tidus demanded, keeping foresight active to watch their movements as he raised his dagger.
"Oh, whoever I want to be,"
they said, shrugging one shoulder casually. "Why are you here? Why are you trying to kill me?" Tidus tightened his grip on his knife. Interrogation was dangerous, and he didn't exactly have the skill or training for it. If he wasn't careful, he could get killed again. But any information he could get would be worth something.
"Let's just say I'm invested in a very particular future,"
the assassin said, flashing a wicked grin. Tidus swallowed hard. The answer was a lot more insidious and intimidating than he had anticipated. He hadn't expected a real answer at all. What was he thinking? He should be running for his life, not staring down someone who had already skewered him through the heart. The assassin leapt at him, blades slashing towards his neck. Tidus caught the movement just in time with the seconds granted him by foresight, and pulled at the time around him. He skimmed back a moment, like making a sharp turn against a sand dune back home. He sidestepped at the same time, appearing 10 feet down the branch at the very moment the assassin struck. His heart hammered wildly in his chest. He'd done it. He'd dodged their attack, even though the assassin's movements were almost too fast to see. He was still alive. The assassin lunged again, So fast, foresight blurred, and Tidus pulled himself back again, scrambling to another branch. His palms were slick with sweat. The attack would have been fatal if it had landed. Tidus pushed his foresight forward, pain edging into his head. Although he ignored it, he needed more warning, time to react. He dropped down to a lower branch and darted towards the tree trunk, giving himself even a few feet of distance as the assassin raced to meet him. They spun to face him, leaf-shaped blades slicing upwards to gut him like a fish. 30 seconds from now. Tidus gritted his teeth and altered course, reached out and grabbed the assassin's arm just as they turned towards him. He twisted hard, then slammed all of his weight against the assassin, pinning them to the tree. His blade pressed against their throat. He tasted blood, but couldn't remember where it had come from. "Why are you doing this?" Tidus demanded. "You know you can't really kill me, so why? What do you think you'll get out of this?"
"Are you going to kill me?"
the assassin asked, features shifting, changing. The old face, the one with pale skin and gray eyes, melted away to reveal a new one. Their blue braids unraveled, releasing feathers and leaves like confetti as the hair shifted to long, dark curls. The gray eyes grew to a vibrant pink and filled with fear. Those eyes were familiar. Ilaria's face looked up at him, tears sliding down her cheeks and lip trembling. Bile rose up in Tidus' throat, and he closed his eyes, turning his head. He tried to force his hand forward to finish the job, to kill the assassin, but he couldn't. Not when they had Ilaria's face, even when he looked away. He knew. The memory of her face spattered with his own blood stabbed into his gut. Tidus pulled at the time around him, found the anchor point, then the thin thread that connected it to him. It was as faint as a spiderweb, but once he latched onto it, he could feel it stretching through the future, past where he could see, tied to another anchor, a buoy. The time he belonged to. Time would always know where he belonged. Tidus imagined wrapping the thread around his wrist, like getting a better grip on a rope, and pulled. The assassin wearing his sister's face vanished beneath him, as everything dissolved into a sandstorm. He should have killed them. He was a coward, weak, pathetic. They knew who he was. They knew who his family was. Terror ripped through him at the thought. They could go after Ilaria. They knew her well enough to become her. He had to go back. He tried to stop the pull, to go back into the past, to finish the job, but the pull was too strong. The momentum was too great. Tidus couldn't stop himself from being pulled back into the future, to his present, any more than he could will a planet to halt in its orbit. He had fallen for the assassin's trick, a desperate ploy to save their own life, or simply a taunt. Either way, it had worked. Tidus had choked. Tidus landed back in the present. He could feel it, the rightness of the time flowing around him. He was on his knees in the time-casting mandala, right where he had left from. How had he made it back here? He crumpled over himself, gasping for air. Horror at his own actions rippled through him. How could he have left the assassin alive? How could he have been such a coward? "Welcome back," Muse said from the middle of the rune map. Had any time passed for her at all? "Antirrhinum, what's the matter with you?" Tidus looked up. Dasha stood in her mandala, looking as ragged as he felt, her hair chopped short and her lip bleeding. Tavarius hadn't returned yet. His spot stood empty. There was an assassin," Tidus gasped. "Someone else was in the past with me. They killed me." "What?" Muse asked, shooting a look at Dasha. "I thought it was part of the test," the girl said with a wary shrug. "No, that's not usually how the trial goes," Muse stated, her features sharpening into a frown.
This will need to be investigated.
The assassin. They knew who I was, Tidus said. They knew my family. Muse's frown deepened, her demeanor stiffening, becoming more mechanical.
That is a very bad sign,
she said, still trying to act casual, to act in control. Tidus could see it was a front now. Muse's barely concealed fear did nothing to quiet the screaming running through his veins.
Let's go, you two,
Muse instructed, turning on her heel. What? What about Tavarius? Tidus asked, pushing himself to his feet. Muse swept over to Tavarius' empty spot and picked something up. A golden dagger.
Plenty of trainees don't make it past the first trial, assassin or no,
Muse informed him, shrugging and sheathing the extra dagger.
We won't be getting any answers from him either way.
Muse ushered them both onto the glass spiral ramp with a wave of her hand.
Hurry up. You're getting one hell of a debrief about this, and you both need a shower.
Dasha walked over to Tidus, grabbing his arm to steady him.
You look pretty rough,
she said, as they both swayed their way up the ramp. Did you kill them? Tidus asked. The assassin that came after you. Dasha shook her head, her lip curling into a snarl.
Wish I had, she said. They kept flying out of reach.
Flying? Tidus asked.
Yeah, they were in a Rindin, I think,
Dasha replied. She leaned toward Tidus like she was expecting them to lean on each other to walk. His knees were still shaking, and he almost accepted the offer, but the hilt of her dagger brushed his shoulder. He straightened, pulling up the meager strength he had left to walk on his own. Dasha might not know yet that they would have to kill to earn their ranks, but Tidus couldn't forget it. At some point, they would be in competition against each other. There was every likelihood that if they made it through the trials, one of them would kill the other.
They had on a freaky mask,
Dasha continued, not outwardly reacting to the fact that he had pulled away.
And I think their feathers were dyed. Stupid annoying. Yours?
Shape changer, Tidus muttered. I didn't manage to kill them either. Dasha shuddered and cracked her neck, rolling her shoulders. They fell silent as they followed Muse back up the glass spiral to the shuttle for the Epoch's Echo. It felt like a lifetime since Tidus had been on a ship or near civilization. A lifetime since he had talked to another person that wasn't himself or the assassin. It had been, he strained to remember, 139 days. Should he adjust his birthday and count himself as older earlier now? Should he bother counting his age at all?
I am invested in a very particular future.
The words ominously slithered through his mind. What did that mean? The assassin knew they couldn't really kill him, not with the weapons they had. So how were they trying to get that future? Did they think by killing him over and over they could wear him down? And then what? Tidus gripped his dagger more tightly, grounding himself in the moment. He wasn't alone anymore, at least not the way he had been back there. He wouldn't be the only one looking for these terrorists. They couldn't get away with it for long, not with the most dangerous force in the Empire after them. He just had to make sure they took out the terrorists before any more danger came to his family. It was, somewhat ironically, just a matter of time.